Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Natasha Janejo, and I am literary lead and a trustee at South Asian Heritage Month. And I'm also co-founder and host of the Decolonial podcast. So today we will be screening a video episode that we did on the Decolonial podcast with Sathnam Sanghera around Empireland. We originally recorded this at the top end of this year. And as a special treat for South Asian Heritage Month, we're releasing the video episode. The original episode is available to listen to on Spotify and Google Podcasts, but you can find it in our link tree on Instagram. So you can follow us at the Decolonial podcast, and that's where you'll find everything on a drop-down menu. If you'd like to listen to the original version, this is the Psalm edit. So you'll find a couple of things that have been bleeped out, because on the Decolonial, we speak a little more freely. So without further ado, I shall hand you over to past tense me and Sathnam, and I hope that you enjoy. We get into some meaty stuff around Empireland, imperialism, what the last year has looked like for Sathnam from the release of the book in February up until when we spoke, and how that has been different, because I interviewed him when the book came out and then interviewed him again after a year, and how his opinions and attitudes have changed, and what his observations have been, and what his experiences have been with backlash and hate mail and things like that. And then we talk about institutional racism and things like that. All of the things that you'll really find us digging into on the Decolonial. So if you haven't read Empireland already, which I strongly recommend you do, it's brilliant. We are doing a giveaway in tandem with this episode in partnership with Penguin Random House. And we have 5 copies of Empireland to give away. So please watch out on our socials for details of that. You will need to like and retweet and follow Sathnam, follow the Decolonial podcast, South Asian Heritage Month, and Penguin as well. And then comment underneath telling us why this book is so important, because it really, really is. And we're really excited to be able to get 5 copies out to 5 lucky winners, so you can read it as well, and it starts some conversations, and share it with your family, and share it with your friends, and lend it to everyone you know, because they should read it too. Okay, I will let you get on with listening and watching this episode, and I hope you have a good evening. Okay, bye. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Decolonial podcast with your host, Natasha. And Maya is not able to join us today, but she is here in spirit. And we are joined by author and journalist Sathnam Sanghera, author of Empireland and Channel 4's recent documentary, Empire State of Mind. Hi, Sathnam. How are you doing?
Hello. Thanks for having me on. This is my last Zoom, podcast of the year. So I'm feeling D-Mob happy.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we're very pleased to have you. You and I first met in February when Empireland was coming out at the Wolverhampton Literature Festival. How have things been since then? How are you doing?
Insane. It's been such a weird year. I mean, Empireland only came out in January. It feels like it came out 5 years ago. There's been so much. There's been the documentary. There's been the wave of racist abuse. There's been the reaction to the documentary, which has been mainly nice, but also I've been trolled to death by the far left. I've just done BBC Hard Talk, which was hard and involved talking. It's just been really, really intense. I'm exhausted, to be honest. But it's been worthwhile. I mean, I'm really glad I did it, but it's nothing about it has been predictable.
I can imagine. That's the thing about, I think, when you are shedding light on our complicated past as a country, I think you're always going to be met with resistance. I wanted to ask you as well, like, the preparation for this book, and we've spoken about this before, the preparation for this book was so extensive, and you did so much research. Did you do that with this in mind, the fact that there would be this kind of backlash?
That's a really good question. No, because I didn't really predict any of this. I mean, also the school's been, the book's been sent into 15,000 copies of it
15,000, yeah.
have been sent into schools. I didn't pick that either. No, what I was really wary of when I began it was I'm not an historian.
Mm.
And so I had massive imposter syndrome. To be honest, I felt like this with every one of my books. When I wrote a memoir when I was 30, I didn't really think I was allowed to write a memoir at the age of 30. It was quite a young age. So I overcompensated and worked really hard on it. And the same with a novel. I didn't really feel like I had a novel in me. And so I spent years working on it. I did the same with this. I just felt like every historian out there was going to kill me. I was going to get things wrong. So I was just incredibly careful. And actually, my editor didn't want me to be so careful. She didn't think I needed a bibliography, that I needed so many footnotes. I had to fight for it. But I just didn't want people to say I got things wrong. I didn't want them to say I'd plagiarized things. And
Yeah.
one of the really surprising things is that not a single historian who I've quoted has complained. And I think I've only just realized that actually historians like being quoted because, often they're writing for a very small audience. And if you can bring them to a bigger audience and they feel like their work is being read and making a difference, it's actually a good thing. So I was very surprised about that. But
Yeah.
I sort of anticipated something, but it's that thing where sometimes you worry about something and the thing you worry about doesn't happen, but some other crap you didn't predict happens
Yes, yeah.
instead.
Something
Yeah,
swipes you from left field. You're like, oh, I didn't
yeah,
have that armor on. Just for reference for everybody else, the bibliography is a quarter of this book. That's how thorough it was. And it almost has been a layer of protection here, because the ways in which pure factual information that you're laying out here has been criticized, the ways in which people are in their criticism and in the hate mail you've been getting, revoking your identity and your right to even be saying these things. I'm so glad that you can point to the bibliography and go, yeah, but this is based in truth. This is based in fact. This is based in historical information. And
yeah,
it is something to hold on to. Not that you should have to be clear, like not that you should have to at all. But it's
yeah.
one of those things.
I think there's an idea that if you're brown, um, you can't be trusted with history. You're going to be too emotional about it.
100%.
I
Mm,
definitely felt that when I was writing. I was like, I don't want people to say I'm just writing this out of emotional, and as an emotional reaction to the British Empire. And so, yeah, I probably overcompensated for that. But even the things I've said in the book, I mean, I go on and on in the book about how this is not a balance sheet view of
mm,
empire. I don't believe in the balance sheet. That's a basic way of seeing really complicated history. I say it 3 or 4 times in the book. I've said it in every single bloody interview I've done. And yet I still get people coming to events and shouting at me
mm.
for 5 or 10 minutes about how I've been too negative about British Empire. And it's like, dude, for a start, it's not about a book about British Empire. It's about how Britain was changed by empire. It's not a view of how Britain changed the world,
Exactly.
Secondly, I say it repeatedly in the book. This is not the, and yet they still come. I mean, I have been sort of stalked by certain men. It's always men,
Mm.
mostly white men, but actually there's been a couple of Indian men too. There's one guy who has turned up at almost every event I've done. He's turned up at online events. He's
Oh my
written
God.
reviews on Amazon, on Goodreads. He's left comments on the Times website on pieces I've written. He left a comment on a TV review of my documentary saying the same thing. Sathnam's too negative about British Empire. These are the achievements of empire. I just can't escape it. This guy is basically
How much time does
he's
he have?
he's probably listening to this, mate. And also he's an Indian. He's of color.
Oh, good
I
God.
think he's Sri Lankan, and also he totally misquotes me. He just calls me an immigrant. I say in the book at length, I am not an immigrant. I am
Exactly.
second generation. I don't even like the phrase second generation immigrant. I'm British,
Yes.
and
Yeah,
he
exactly.
completely ignores the fact everything I say about the balance sheet in the book. And it's, to be honest, I've had it with events. I'm not sure I can do any more events because
Mm.
in a way it's great. They get good turnouts, but there's always that guy. Sometimes specifically that guy, but there's always a version of him. And people pay money to shout at me, and it's like it's great in that it makes the events feel, it feels like they matter, but at the same time I've just had enough of being people's kind of punch bag.
Yeah. And quite rightly so. We have a question from Maya that sort of follows on from this. And she said, how was your mental health when writing the book and gathering all of this potentially painful information? And my question leading on from this is, and how does that carry through in terms of writing the book and then dealing with that, and then that being complete, and then now the fallout of it is people mirroring that back to you inaccurately, and then how is that emotional toll as well?
That's another good question. Thank you, Maya. Yeah, I think my mental health during the book, though, I did have problems with it in that the atrocities, writing about those, I found that quite traumatic, and I started having nightmares about the atrocities. And I actually I was talking to a historian who writes about atrocities, and he gave me some very good advice. And he was like, "Look, don't read this stuff after 2 p.m." And I find that
Brilliant.
made a difference in that I didn't go to bed with these things in my head. And actually, there's a book to be written about this. There's a famous historian of atrocities in Asia who killed herself after writing a really acclaimed book, and I think it can affect your mental health. And yeah, I mean, I try to avoid those bits of the book, but people sometimes, remind me. And yeah, that was difficult, but I also think it's important. I mean, I was asked to write a kids' version of this, and I've decided not to because I don't want to water it down.
Yeah.
But in terms of the publication, it's just like, I guess it's just having attention is quite intense and insane, but also empire is the most toxic subject on the planet. It's about race, basically, and so you attract extreme comments on both sides, and also just being on TV. I mean, David Baddiel once had a great line about being on TV. He was just like, being on TV is basically millions of people having the wrong idea of who you are, and getting the racist mail, physical letters, and also online was
Yeah.
hard. And also actually being trolled by the left, I'm sorry, by the far left, it's been mad as well. And it did get to me a bit, but ultimately I've become very thick-skinned. I think I'm ready for anything now, but I do need a holiday.
Yes, yeah, I can imagine. It's a baptism of fire, isn't it? Are you okay with me reading some quotes of some of the hate mail that you shared
Oh, sure, yeah,
with
yeah,
us?
I'm used to it now.
Because it's
Some of it's quite funny.
it's grueling, isn't it? Some of the things that I've just picked out from things that you've shared with us are, you are a product of British patronage. Choke on it, Sathnam. You've been called a race baiter. And then in your recent episode on Channel 4, you said someone has written, you are not your nation. It's not your nation, Babu. You're a third world Tolian leeching off another nation. And then they were talking about how you'll be sent back home. And the thing that is a common thread throughout all of these is that your belonging is constantly revoked. Your right to be here is constantly revoked by these people. And it's this sense of how you should be grateful for where you are and where we've put you. How dare you criticize us? And in the book, you refer to us as British people. You refer to we a lot. You refer to us being one. Um, and this is something Maya picked out as well, and I love this question. And she said, how do you feel about using we in the book, especially since some British people have reacted so negatively towards it? Do you feel the same way now that they've so firmly created a them and us narrative?
Oh, another good question. I The wee thing comes up a lot. To be
Mm,
honest, when I wrote it, I didn't think about it. It's just the way I talk about British Empire. I think I am British. The Sikhs were massively involved with Empire. It is we. I don't see it as a blame game. I feel like I'm part of the British enterprise.
mm,
Um, but one of the things that came up when I showed the book to historians, because I wanted to get triple checked, one of the historians said, "Look, on your first day of doing a history degree, you get told by the tutor never use the word we, because it wasn't new. You weren't there in the medieval times,
mm,
and." And I kept I didn't want to change it because you know what? I think there's a value in not being a formal historian. And I also think there's something unifying about saying we. I think too often empire turns into an argument between the children of the colonized and the children of the colonizers. And
yeah.
actually, if you say we, you diffuse the whole thing, you know? And yeah, I mean, I feel like empire people sometimes think we've got to reject everything that empire touched. We've got to tear down the statues. We've got to reject those MBEs, and I respect that argument, but also I think it's mad because empire explains so much about who I am. I mean, I
Yeah.
wouldn't be here if it wasn't for empire. The language we use is influenced by empire. 83,000 Sikhs died fighting wars for empire, and so I don't mind it. I mean, it's like trying to take the egg out of a baked cake. I don't think you can take empire out of modern life. It explains our
Mm.
wealth, our psychology, our politics. It's everywhere. So I don't think you can delete it. So hence the word we.
Yeah. I agree. I think it is a universal term, and I think particularly in this time, which is so divisive, it's something that is necessary, and it's necessary now. And I think it will actually be something that combats people feeling so emboldened to say things like this. And every time I come across people that speak this way or think this way, the only thing I think is, you only think this and you're only saying this because you don't know your own history, because you're so ignorant and you don't know why we're here, and you don't know who we are, and you don't know who you are. You don't know who you are at all, which is why I love when you say in the book as well, I can't help but feel that I'm on a similar journey, that in embarking on this project, I'm making an effort to decolonize myself. And the question of how imperialism shapes the psychology of the colonized and the children of the colonized. And it raises another question: how might the experience of British Empire have shaped the psychology of the colonizers as well? And I like that you are positing this question not only for us and how post-colonial legacy reverberates through time in terms of how it affects us, but how it also affects British identity for British white people. And I wanted to pose that question to you. How do you think? How do you think it affects the children of, well, colonizers?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question. And, it's something Edward Said has written about and George Orwell. And their argument being that, actually, George's especially, that there's something dehumanizing about being the colonizer, about
Mm.
it must have affected them, strapping Indians to the end of cannons and blowing them into pieces. They were hit by the flesh. That must have really scarred them in some way. And I think you could trace that psychology all the way into our politics. I think finally, I can't remember who said this, finally the British are realizing what it's like to be ruled over by the British.
Yeah.
Our politics is a reflection. I feel like the way we endlessly elect these Etonians who have an imperial tone of voice, who
Mm.
write imperial books about imperial times in their spare time. Something in us wants these people as leaders. Something in our national psychology needs this. And we're paying the price. And maybe finally we're realizing we don't need this. We need to break away from this psychological addiction.
I agree. And it's because I think, in my view, in any case, it's because we are told and we are taught to glorify that age, that we are taught that it was the golden age of this country. We are taught that imperialism is something to be proud of. And so that repetitive pattern of seeking out those power structures is inbuilt in the British psyche, because we equate it with glory, we equate it with success. And and,
Also,
and we
I think there's a simple fact that also the ruling class in empire are the ruling class now. It's
yes, yeah,
basically the conservative
absolutely.
part. It's the same social class.
Yeah.
It's the same party, the Conservative Party, and there's links. It's just the same crap. We
Mm.
haven't decolonized ourselves as a nation. We've got rid of empire, sort of, well, mostly, but we haven't got rid of it in our psychology.
No, not at all. And we will always revert back to it because we don't know any better. And we don't know the full picture of what it was. And you and I have spoken about this before. There was so much dissent at the time from key public figures at the time, from a prime minister at the time, where people were saying this is wrong. What we're doing in the colonies is wrong. And you list them all as well. You list them all here. So I'm quoting the book again, but you say, equally, there was not a single phase of empire when the enterprise was not being criticised with the establishment. Voices of opposition, including Robert Graves, H.G. Wells, E.M. Forster, George Orwell, H.H. Munro, and then Prime Minister between 1868 and 1894. William Gladstone famously complained that in South Africa, 10,000 Zulus had been slaughtered for no other reason, no other offence than their attempt to defend against your artillery with their naked bodies, their hearths, their homes, their wives, and their families, and then campaigned for election to Parliament in late 1879 with a speech about the injustice of the ongoing Afghan campaign. This is so important. It's such important context to understand about our history that we weren't taught in schools, that we
Yeah.
don't know. And that should be embedded in the British psyche so we understand that someone that ran for prime minister in this country could quite clearly see and logically advocate against what we were doing
Yeah. Yeah.
abroad, and the dehumanize and disenfranchisement of other nations and of other people. And because we only hear one side of the story, we glorify what was done before. And I think it's just bananas. But that's why I'm so grateful that you've done this, and I think it's remarkable as well that with Penguin Lit in Colour, that they have distributed 15,000 copies to schools across the country. And what is encouraging as well is what you share on social media, the letters that you receive from people where it has changed their viewpoint, um, where it has forced a parent and a child to have a difficult conversation about history, where it is moving the needle. How does that feel when you get letters like that?
Yeah, and I do get a lot of letters like that, and I should talk about them more because otherwise I just let the negativity
Mm.
kind of take the attention. And actually, that has been the majority of my year. People saying it's changed their minds. They had no idea. Oxbridge graduates in history saying they knew nothing about empire.
Good Lord.
Politicians. I mean, God, I had the former politician Malcolm Turnbull, from the former Prime Minister of Australia, ring me about it, and it's just been amazing. And even people who disagree with me, like George Osborne, who's now the chair of the British Museum, 3 cabinet ministers have been in touch.
Mm.
This is a once in a life experience for a writer to write something that is immediately taught in schools, that everyone in power who has interest in the subject has read. This is not going to happen to me again. And I've been trying, amid the madness, to enjoy it because
Mm.
it's not something that happens very often for a writer. But it does. It is. Yeah, it does. The attention, it can also be a bit of a burden.
Yeah.
But also, I
Um,
mean, your point about people disagreeing throughout the history of empire, another reason why I use the word we, it's like there's a great anti-colonialism is a great British tradition, just as colonialism is. So another reason why I don't mind the word we.
mm. And it's incredibly important, and it's an important point to be making. How do you feel about stolen artifacts?
Um, I actually like our museums. I mean, I know some people who want to decolonize the museums want them shut down, and I get it. But I like the British Museum. I like going to the V&A, but I think we can return, many of our contested items, and still have the British Museum. Only
Mm.
1% of the artifacts are on display. Famously, I can't remember. I think it was David Cameron who said, "Oh, we can't return the Koh-i-Noor diamond because then the British Museum will be empty." And it's like it wouldn't be empty, dude. There's 99% of the collection is in storage.
Mm.
And when I met George Osborne, and he said he'd read the book, and he said, your point about 1% of the collection on display is not valid because the rest of the items in storage, they're very small. Lots of them are very small, and it's like, what the hell are you on about? I mean, the Koh-i-Noor diamond's very small, still
Hmm.
incredibly valuable. Some of the small items are human remains, and I think we could easily return a load of stuff, and it'd be good for us. It'd be good for the museums. You'd have great exhibitions, and you would improve our relationship with the world at a time where we really need to improve our relationship with the world. And also, we're falling behind the argument because it's happening in Germany, in France, and America, and around the world. And private collectors are returning artifacts themselves, even though they paid millions for them. And so we're falling behind the international and the moral argument.
Do you think that's because we can't let go of this identity of formal glory?
Yeah, I think we're further behind France and Germany when it comes to facing up to colonialism. But there are countries, even behind us. I mean, I went to Portugal the other week, and God, Black Lives Matter and the idea of decolonization has not reached Portugal.
Oh,
You
yes.
know,
Yeah. Portugal has a very long and bloody history with colonialism.
yeah, the first global empire, and they're really proud
Mm,
of it. But
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think we are falling behind. But yeah, we're slowly catching up. I think young people are making a big difference.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. There is a filter that you can use on your phone via an app that you go to the British Museum and you view all of the artifacts that are there through this viewfinder on your phone. And it's a new tour. It's a new audio tour, and it scans everything that you're looking at and tells you where it's from, how it was stolen, what it really means, and whether it was defaced or not, and where it should be. And I love it. It's absolutely amazing. And that's Gen Z. That's what they're doing.
Yeah, and it was a woman called Alex Proctor who started doing the uncomfortable art tours of museums, and she's an art historian, I think, and wrote a great book. And she began all this, and actually, all our museums are having to respond because of apps like that, tours like Alice's, young people watching films like Black Panther, which has that famous scene
Mm,
set in the British Museum. People don't want this stuff anymore. I think young people feel the way about museums the way my generation felt about zoos. Like feel really
yeah.
uncomfortable with the idea of seeing this loot, and they're catching up very, very slowly, but they are catching up. And the British Museum have begun to change their plaques and their captions, and they're taking it on board to a degree.
Mm. And there is a way of returning these items and artifacts to their original owners, but they will loan them back to you for display. They will loan them back to the museum. But it's about ownership, and the ownership is vitally important. And I think I agree with you. I think that we are a little behind in that exchange, and
Mm,
I think that um, we need to really sit in the discomfort of looking our difficult past in the face, and I think that's where we are at the moment. That's the uncomfortable part of it. But if the plaques are
mm.
changing, other things will change too. I think it's just a slower progression. We've just got a
Mm.
steeper hill to climb.
Yeah, I think we should remember that some museums in Britain are better than others. Our
Mm,
taxpayer-funded museums, the big ones, they're the ones who are being very conservative. And actually, there's legislation that stops them from returning some stuff.
mm,
But there are other museums like the Aberdeen University Museum, which I visited for the TV documentary, and they're not restricted by legislation. They can do what they want. And there are museums like the Aberdeen University Museum which are returning stuff. They're actively, they're looking at human remains. They're getting in touch with the local, in the case of the stuff I saw, the local Hindu temple, and saying, what can we do with these human remains? Can we put this person to rest? They're giving back really valuable stuff, to the Benin bronzes they've got. So
mm.
some universities in Britain are doing great stuff.
That's incredible. And I know that the maritime museums in Greenwich, they're keenly aware of their difficult past and how that and our past with relation to the transatlantic slave trade as well. So I know that they've done so much work in going through their archives and displaying and educating people about what actually went on and our part in it as well. And I agree with you. There's so much good work happening.
Mm.
Um, and it's not to say that we're not moving forward at all. I think it's just we are in an age of awakening, I think, and we'll get there. I do believe we'll get there. And I
The
think we're
problem is that this government have launched a culture war on this, and
oh God,
they
yes,
so
yeah,
Oliver Dowden has,
absolutely.
has been writing letter when he was culture minister, was writing letters to museums saying we're gonna reduce your funding if you
Mm,
engage with the woke on these things. And trustees who are interested in these subjects have been fired from their jobs, at their volunteer positions, because they consider too woke.
Speaking of which, in relation to our government, this year we've had a statement come out from them saying that there is no institutional racism in this country,
Mm,
and yet there have been a great many things going on. Particularly in the news, there's been a lot of focus on Azim Rafiq's statement for because of the ECB's role in his time in Yorkshire County Cricket Club and the mishandling of that. And yet we've been hearing institutional racism echoed and spoken about so clearly and quite rightly throughout that entire process and openly. And yet we are dealing with a national situation where we're being gaslighted about this. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, we are being gaslit, and there's so many straightforward illustrations of institutional racism. The most obvious of which is the Windrush Scandal. You know,
Mm.
I don't see white people being deported to a country they don't recognize. You know, and they've even acknowledged it's a scandal, and yet they've only paid, I think, 5% of people compensation. You know, there is a straightforward example of institutional racism. If you want another one, the example I always use is the 2018 fast-tracked civil service recruitment scheme, which attracted
Oh
339
yes, yeah.
applicants from black people. 339 black people applied for that prestigious scheme. Not one got a job. Are you telling me that not one of those 339 people was good enough for the civil service, or does the civil service have a problem with institutional racism?
Mm.
Straightforward in my point of view. And you know what, it all goes back to empire. Both the inquiry for the Windrush scandal and the Stephen Lawrence inquiry concluded that we needed to change our curriculums to reflect our racially diverse society. We need to teach empire, and we still don't do it. We still resist it. You know, there's a bit of empire now on the school curriculum, but in general, given it was the biggest thing we ever did, it should be mandatory. It should be alongside the Holocaust as one of the things that we
100%.
have to teach, because otherwise we'll never realize why or accept why we're a multicultural society, and we'll never accept that racism exists in Britain.
Precisely. And more recently as well, in the last week or so, we now are in a situation where you can have your nationality and your passport and your identity in this country revoked. And so we could be sent back to India and Pakistan, and even though we're born in Britain, and I'm not sure what the terms are around this, and what precludes it from happening to me, and that is terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying, and what that does to your sense of belonging and British identity for people that are first generation, second generation here. I'm like you, I have major issues with that terminology. Are you a first generation or second generation immigrant? I'm British. I was born here. I'm British. My heritage is South Asian and British, and they are entwined and fused with one another. But my government has mandated that I can be sent back to wherever they deem fit if I don't comply with X, Y, and Z. And that to me is one of the biggest red flags indicating that we have a situation where we are institutionally racist, because there are so many checks and balances that should have stopped that from even happening, from even being
Yeah,
passed.
I don't see white people worrying about having their citizenship revoked.
Exactly.
It's brown people, and
Or
and
any
and
equivalent.
the depressing thing that it has been. I mean, the Begum case as well. It has been
Mm.
brown politicians who have been behind some of this legislation, and it's quite depressing, isn't it? I mean, I do think ultimately we have to accept it is good we have brown people in government. It's good. It means that we are improving. But it's depressing that they're using their power sometimes to shut the door and to make the situation worse for fellow brown people.
Um, let's talk post-colonial legacy in terms of how it affects us personally, and how it kind of reverberates through time into the generations that we have lived through. I remember you saying in your documentary on Channel 4, it's on 4OD, you should watch it, by the way, everyone, it's great. You said that your family, and I'm sure you've said this before in other things interviews that I've seen of you as well. Um, you said that your family makes fun of how bad your Punjabi is, and you often make reference to how crap your Punjabi is. Um, I was wondering what the story was there. Did you speak Punjabi originally when you were younger? Is Punjabi your mother tongue? And how did you lose it if you did?
I actually think I go on about that too much, and my Punjabi is much better than a lot of my family's Punjabi. It's just I don't speak. The only person I use Punjabi with is my mother, and so I just and my father, and I'm just out of practice with it. But it was my first language. I didn't speak
Same.
English until probably like lots of us until I went to school. I remember the feeling of going to school and not being able to understand people. I remember
Mm.
pretending I could speak English with my elder siblings, which is one of my first memories.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think I probably because I'm not a brilliant speaker, but equally, I'm not. I think my brother's worse. We argue about this a lot. My brother's much worse, and he's always mocking me for my crap Punjabi. But yeah, I mean, it's also I'm always aware when I'm on when you do TV and you speak Punjabi that there's gonna be loads of people slagging you off. And actually,
Do you
something,
think?
yeah, because people slag you off when you're on TV anyway. But there was something that came up in my first documentary. It gives me a chance to finally talk about this. I went to Amritsar and I'm ordering a lassi, and I
Mhm.
say, "Oh, I've actually never had a lassi before." And loads of people are like, "Oh, coconut, Satnam's not Indian, blah blah blah." And the other day I went home, I was talking to my mum. I said, "You know what, Mum? We never had lassis when we were a kid." And she went, "Oh, you never had them because I hate them." And I think there's an important point within that is that everyone thinks that their experience of Asian life is the defining experience, when
Oh, yeah.
actually we all have different experiences. But loads of people say, "Oh, he's a coconut because he's never had a lassi." It's like, actually, no, it's just reflective of my particular experience. And we've got to stop kind of condemning each other. So I guess when I'm criticized, being self-deprecating about my Punjabi is probably preempting that kind of criticism. But
Mm.
I love the fact that I speak Punjabi. I like the fact that I'm bilingual. I like the
I
fact
think
I
it's
can read.
great.
I can read it a bit. I
Can
like the
you read
fact.
Punjabi?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that complicated. And I like
It
the fact
is
that.
for me. I find it so difficult. I find it so difficult. Punjabi was my first language. And then when we went to school, I had trouble speaking English. And our school essentially terrified my parents and said, these children will not get on in academic life unless you stop speaking your mother tongue at
Mm,
home and you only speak English with them. And so my dad's Sindhi and my mum's Punjabi. Um, and they're both from Pakistan. So my dad would speak Urdu with my mum, and my mum would speak Punjabi back, because they both speak like 9 languages. And
mm.
those two languages would be flying over our heads when we were little. But we spoke Punjabi because it was what our mum spoke, and that was our first language. And then all of a sudden, it was English in the house, and I lost all of my Punjabi. But now I understand like Urdu and I understand Punjabi when I hear it, but then when I try and speak it, it's this Frankenstein language, which is like half Punjabi, half Urdu, and it just is horrible. And whenever I'm around Asian people and I talk, I think I'm making sense. And then their grandma's like, "Who is this girl? Get her out of here. I don't know what she's saying. Who is she?" And I'm like, "No, no, no. I make sense." But when I hear them both and someone
Mm.
switches, I can't tell when they've switched.
Yeah,
I,
that's
I
very
can't
interesting. And
tell.
that's again, is you've had a very particular experience, and I wouldn't judge you for that. But on TV, people judge you for everything. But also, I think the defining narrative when we were growing up, when I was, you were younger than me, was that people who speak Indian languages need to speak English. They need to stop speaking the Indian languages. They're going to be
Oh
held
God,
back at
yeah.
school.
Mm.
There were loads of newspaper coverage saying that there were so many kids speaking Punjabi in Wolverhampton schools that even English kids started speaking Punjabi. It was
I love
scaremongering.
that.
When the fact is, kids who speak English as a second language do better at school.
100%.
They are academically much better.
My mum
And
went and trained as a teacher to prove these people wrong. And
mm,
like, she's great. She's got like 6 postgraduate degrees. And she was like, "Cool, I'm going to go do a PGCE. Thank you." And then she came back and went, "I have data to prove that this is all, excuse my language, bullshit. And it's better for cognitive development, it's better for personal social development, and it actually produces more intelligent children to be bi and trilingual. What the hell were you talking about?" And my mother tongue was colonized out of my mouth. But it's so frustrating because at that time, our parents were at the mercy, and we as well as children, we were at the mercy of whatever the school system told us about who we were, and we would bend and fold ourselves to fit that mold. And I noticed as well, part of your documentary, part two of your documentary, you went back to your old school, you went back to your grammar school, and you met with your old headmaster. Did you find that there was a struggle internally for you in terms of your British heritage and your Indian heritage going through your school system as well, in the way that I had in the beginning of my academic life?
I guess there's different phases of my schooling. I actually think I look back at my primary schools and the infant schools. I just think how amazing the teachers were. The teachers were all white,
Mm,
and most of the kids, I think 80% of the kids were Asian or black, and most of them had English as a second language. But I don't remember any judgment. And I
good.
remember like one of my first academic successes was writing in English, and that was probably 2 years after I joined school and I couldn't speak English, and they celebrated it. And so I think my primary school and infant school were amazing. I mean, I suppose they had one of the best educations in the world. I went to a very good selective grammar school, and then I went to Cambridge. But I look back on what I was taught, and I just see gaps. I see huge gaps, and I see it as a failure of education, which I managed to rectify by writing books. But there were so many big gaps. And when I went back to meet my headmaster, who is retired, and he acknowledged it. He was like, "Look, we were just blind to all this stuff. We didn't know, and we didn't teach these things properly. We didn't talk about the imperial contribution to both world wars. We didn't know about it
Mm,
ourselves. How could we teach it? When we're teaching Jane Austen, Mansfield Park, a book I hated studying, not one of the teachers pointed out the whole slavery subplot,
mm,
and which has now become like the main way people talk about Mansfield Park. It just didn't occur to people. They were a victim of their own education. So how could they teach us? But I think things are really changing a lot now.
I agree. I was actually quite surprised by his response, by his
Mm.
complete humility in admitting that they didn't know any better. And genuinely, it surprised me. I thought somebody in his sort of cohort, in terms of age and in terms of education, would be rather defensive, because that's generally what we get when you are questioning somebody's identity and history. The natural response is to defend
Yeah,
that identity, because you are questioning absolutely everything about who they are and who they have built up this image of themselves. And so their natural response is to defend, and they feel as though they're being gaslit, because they feel that
yeah,
they
yeah.
know their identity. And so that's what you are fighting. And so really, that was the one of the it was so bizarre, because it was such a pleasant exchange, but that was the most jarring thing for me, watching both episodes of your documentary. How
Interesting.
easily and how much grace there was in the way that he just yielded and said, "Yeah, that was just a failing of ours. We didn't know any better." And I went, "Oh, okay." I was cooking at the time, and I was just like, "What?" And then I had to go back and rewind it and just watch it again, because it was
Mm.
just so shocking to me, and such a pleasant surprise. It was really
Yeah,
refreshing.
I've got to say he's not untypical. Again, I've been there's been so much focus on the racist abuse. I've got probably 100 letters sitting behind
Mm,
me from people in their 70s, 80s, and actually even 90s saying, "I didn't know this. I wasn't taught this. Thank you for opening my mind." I don't think age is an excuse to be closed-minded,
yeah.
and there are people out there, white people and brown people, willing to change their minds. I hope I'm like that when I'm older. I just hope. I think it's the whole point of young people is to reject the values of older generations. But when older generations go on and on about cancel culture, aren't young people terrible? And it's like this is always the way. And I
Yeah.
hope I accept that as I get older, that I don't endlessly spend all my time saying young people are ridiculous.
I wonder whether it's that as we get older, we are less precious about um, clinging to identity. I think the ego, the grasp on ego lessens, and I think that we are possibly more relaxed about.
Maybe,
about who
yeah.
we are.
I remember interviewing Tony Benn once, and towards the end of his life, and he said, aging has a way of making you a Buddhist. He says you just stop caring about power, status. You
Mm,
don't want things. You don't care about money. You don't care about sex. And it's like it just makes you really wise and detached from the worldly obsession with material things and status. So maybe
mm.
you're right.
Maybe that's how it should go. So, there is a lot of talk in your book, quite rightly as well, about war, about service as well. We're doing a lot of work in this country to recognise South Asian and Commonwealth contribution to the war effort. Do you think this is sufficient? And if not, what more do you think needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most thing is when I wrote the book, I thought I pretty much knew everything about Empire. The surprise about making the documentary was everything they showed me I didn't know about, and one of the things I was most shocked about was the way World War One Indian soldiers were treated in Brighton. Because I knew the story about the pavilion, I didn't realize there was another hospital where Indian soldiers were basically treated like prisoners
Mm,
and seen as sex pests. And I also didn't know that is continuing today. When I met that Commonwealth soldier from Fiji, Foxy Kokonasiga, it's quite hard to say the name, and he, fought for this country for years. He saw friends of his die in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. His son plays rugby for England, and yet at one point the whole family thought they were going to be deported because they didn't apply for residency in the right way, because you've got to apply very quickly within a certain amount of days. You've got to pay a lot of money.
mm,
It's another symptom of the hostile environment. So basically you've got thousands of people fighting for your country, all of them usually people of color, and then when they apply for the residency they're legally entitled to, you make it very hard for them. And that is just a continuation of the way in which people of color who fought for this country over hundreds of years were treated like crap. I mean, the
mm.
most shocking thing is the Commonwealth Grades Commission, which this year said that up to 350,000 soldiers, possibly of color, died for this country and never had their sacrifice recorded. Like no grave,
Mm.
sometimes not even written down. That, I mean, another example of straightforward institutional racism. That's like a city the size of Leicester, dying,
Yeah.
and their sacrifice not even being registered. It's like, what, man?
But that's the thing. It's the bodies not even mattering, and it's strapping to
Mm.
cannons and blowing people up. It's the theme that is constant throughout, whether it's us being the enemy or us being on their side. Our bodies don't matter. They have
Yeah,
historically and habitually not mattered. The
they're
way that we
cannon fodder.
die, yeah, does not matter. Burial rights do not matter. Our humanity is always on the table, and it is always the first chip that is thrown
Yeah.
in
By
and
the way,
gambled.
I think I wasn't sure about the figure. Maybe it's 35,000 or 350,000. I'll need to Google it, or maybe the listeners can Google it. It's a
Mm.
lot, regardless. And yeah, it only just came out this year, and even when it came out, we had the Telegraph saying, "Oh, I know, it doesn't matter." These people, it's not the way these people wanted to be buried or remembered. They didn't want to be remembered. Right. I'm sure they didn't
Sure.
want
Yeah,
their
of course
sacrifice
not.
for a country that colonized them to be remembered.
Good Lord.
Yeah.
It's harrowing, isn't it? It's absolutely ridiculous. So what do you think we need to do? Like, what do you think needs to be done? If you were in charge, what would you do?
Well, I think obviously the main thing is education. And the only mandatory part of the history curriculum is the Holocaust, quite rightly.
Mm,
But the Empire needs to be alongside it. We need to listen to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the Windrush inquiry. We keep on having circular crises. Like every three weeks, my phone goes and it's a BBC journalist saying, "Oh, there's been a scandal about racism. Will you come and talk about it?" And I've stopped talking about it because every time I say the same thing.
mm,
It's like we don't know about why we're a multicultural society. We don't understand that we're multicultural because we had a multicultural empire, and we
mm.
need to teach it. And they're like, what about other solutions? Like, no, we need to teach it. That is
Yeah,
the
that's the solution.
one single solution. We need to teach it. We need to understand why we're like this,
Mm.
why we are the modern country that we are. And so, but if it's never taught, I'm going to keep on getting these calls for the rest of my
Yeah.
life.
Well,
You know?
people don't know about the Nationality Act. Why don't people know
Yeah.
about that?
Actually, I
Peop-
think people, even Asian people and brown people, don't know about it.
True, very true.
Yeah.
It's
The,
bananas.
the level of knowledge is very low because I think we've been conditioned by the dominant narrative in the media in our lifetime is that immigrants arrived here without permission to take advantage of
Asking, yeah,
British hospitality, and that we
100%.
should be grateful for it. Even in my community, it was never talked about the sacrifice that we made, the way
Or
brown people built
partition. What happened
partition,
with partition?
the way we built the NHS,
Yeah.
the way something like a quarter of all the doctors at one point in Wales were South Asian, the way 44% of the NHS now, the medical staff, are Black and Asian.
Mm,
These contributions, I don't think are remembered even within our communities.
exactly. But we are still living in an environment where if you have a person of color in a Christmas advert, people will riot. So
Yeah. Yes.
it is bizarre. Barbados became a republic and was no longer under the official rule of the Queen. Do you think that other colonies and former colonies following suit is something that will lead us to progression, or do you think it's something that will cause more divisiveness?
I feel like it's the beginning of something that should have begun a long time ago. I'm actually going to Barbados in a few weeks,
Oh,
COVID
brilliant.
permitting. I think it's a very interesting place. And if you look at what the Caribbean countries say about imperial legacies, it's not good.
Yeah.
The CARICOM countries are campaigning for compensation for what the legacy of slavery. The ways in which when Britain left, the Caribbean, it didn't leave any money to build an education system. They argue that the health inequalities in the Caribbean can be traced back to empire and slavery. Some people argue that actually the mental illness, the absent fathers, when you separate families in the slave economy,
Mm,
obviously you're going to leave a legacy, psychological
absolutely.
legacy. So I think they're saying really interesting things, but we're not even listening. We're not listening. I don't
Mm,
think there's even been a formal response to what the countries said. Now, I think they came together, the CARICOM countries in the Caribbean, and said, "This is what we want." And there was some evidence that the letter wasn't even replied to. So when
Jesus.
the Queen is no longer the symbolic head of the state in Barbados, we are way off what we need to be talking about, which is actual reparations.
Actual,
You know,
indeed. Yeah. I'm of the same view. And
and
and, and
one of the few times where we did give money to Jamaica recently, it was to help David Cameron help build a prison in Jamaica for deported criminals
Love that.
from
Love that
Britain.
for us. Jesus Christ. But this is the thing though. This is a country that was paying reparations to the families that owned slaves after the slave trade ended on their insurance policies that were taken out on people as property. As a country, we were still paying on those insurance policies up until 2015, and that was coming out of
Yeah.
taxpayer money.
Yeah,
Taxpayer
I mean,
money.
yeah, a massive scandal, but also the way the government reported that. And in 2015,
Exactly.
the government tweeted saying, "Isn't it great? We've just paid off
Yeah.
no, it's not great that
You
we
shouldn't have been doing
paid
it in the first place.
20
You should be
million
paying
compensation.
reparations.
Yeah, that we paid 20 million pounds in compensation to the owners and gave nothing to the slaves, and we didn't build
Mm,
an education system or a health system, and they were left to live with this stuff for centuries."
100%. I release the names and ask them to make a donation. That's my suggestion.
Mm. Yeah, it's really screwed up the way we basically see ourselves as the country that abolished slavery, and we
Yes,
forget that we dominated the trade for large
indeed.
periods of time.
And profited off it, and we were the beneficiaries of it as well, and that's why I think people are so reluctant to get rid of the statues, because they only want the glory, they don't want the context. And what you need and what you require is context. If we're not giving everybody the whole picture, then
Mm.
everybody is losing, everyone is missing out, and we are just going to create generations upon generations of misinformed, ridiculous, woefully ill-educated people. And that's not a good look for us either, when the rest of the world is waking up and the rest of the world is acting and the rest of the world is moving forward, and we are just entrenching ourselves in denial and solipsism around, and it's centered around ego.
Yeah, and I think you can remember both things. You can remember abolition, which was a great thing to do.
Yeah.
We can celebrate it, but we can remember that actually black people were involved in abolition.
Yes. Yeah.
That seems to have been forgotten. But also, we can remember that we dominated the slave trade for large periods, and it made lots of cities, lots of individuals very, very rich. That we still live with the benefits of it. I think you can remember both things, whereas in the media, it's either one or the other.
Yes,
You know?
it's so polarized now, and
Yeah.
there is a middle ground and a grey area where we can all be informed and we can understand it, and look at it critically. And I'm a big fan of looking at things critically. Take these things, let's put them in a museum and let's add context. And like you say, education is key, and that's the thing that will push this forward, and that's the thing that will move the needle. It needs to be centered around information and education.
I agree.
Sathnam, thank you so much for joining us. This has been absolutely incredible.
No, thanks for having me. I'm sorry Maya couldn't make it. I understand there's
Me
a power cut
too.
in Wembley. That's a pretty good excuse.
There is, bless her. It's not going to be sorted until later this afternoon, unfortunately. But she was very, very, very sad to miss this, and she says hello. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for joining us. You can watch Empire State of Mind, both episodes, on 4OD. We have put a link to it in our link tree, which is on our Instagram page. So it's the Decolonial podcast. And if you click on it, there is a link to it and you can go straight to it and watch the episodes. We highly recommend that you do. Also, we recommend that you buy Empireland. It's brilliant. It's an absolutely incredible read. Don't read it after 2 p.m. and you will be fine. And you will be absolutely fine. Sathnam, would you like to share your socials, or do you not want to be bothered by people?
Oh yeah, socials. Yeah, no, they're very easy. In my Twitter account is just my first name. I got there early. My Instagram is Sathnam Sanghera, and yeah, I've got a website which is just my first name too. But yes, thanks for listening, and this is my last podcast of the year, so thank you for the support all the way from February till now, Natasha.
Oh no, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. I'm a big fan of your work. I think it's incredible. I think you're doing some fantastic things. So it's absolutely my pleasure and our pleasure to have you on as well. Thanks, everyone. We hope you're keeping safe, and we hope that you are dealing with this awful storm as best you can. We will see you later. Bye now.